We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the Partnerships and Community Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Max Masure. They are the community-centered service designer and UX researcher, diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant, author, and public speaker. I'm sure there's never a boring day in your world. Max, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Hi, thank you for having me. So my name is Max Masure. I use they, them pronouns, and I have a background in being a graphic designer. That's how I started. And then I did more and more UX, user experience design. And now I'm like focusing in UX research. What do I want it to be when I grow up? I wanted to be a designer. I wanted to make things. So I'm not too far from that dream.
Yeah, so you fulfilled your childhood dream there. We love to see it. One of your kind of many hats that you wear is also being involved in equity, diversity, and inclusion. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up to contribute to this work?
So I really dived into this, into DEI more and more when I came out as a trans person. So that was like 4 or 5 years ago. So this is where I really had more like that really opened my eyes into what was happening and to when you were a woman, when you were a man. I was a woman for 35 years, and then I started to be seen as a man when I started my transition. And what I experienced was so different that I realized that when I was seen as a woman, a lot of what was given to me and the lack of trust, the lack of like giving more, I didn't have enough space, like men were talking over me, stuff like that. When that's totally stopped when I was started to be masculine presenting. Mm-hmm. So that was part of like those realization that made me want to be more involved into diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing your kind of story with us here today. And I think, asking someone's personal why is an interesting way to kind of kick off our conversation on the interview series. I know that you kind of help companies also who are interested in transforming their company culture, and wanted to ask what building blocks are needed as a foundation to say, okay, this company is ready to achieve the goal of transforming their workplace.
I would say starting by listening, definitely, and having a way to know what the people are really feeling inside the company, and especially underrepresented folks. Like I would pay attention to people of color, Black folks, indigenous, people with disabilities, trans, gender non-conforming folks, women, to really see how they feel and having like a safe environment where they can speak up. So I would say that listening is the most important. Yeah.
Absolutely. And listening is two ways. An active listener is important as well. I know kind of when we were chatting earlier, you've trained a global hotel company to really better serve specific populations of employees. So for example, there are transgender and gender nonconforming customers. What tangible advice do you have for other companies to do a better job of attracting and also really important retaining transgender and gender nonconforming employees as well?
Yeah, so definitely hiring more trans and gender nonconforming folks and to really pay attention on how to keep them, because underrepresented folks are like leaving after 2 years. I think that's what I read. They don't really stay long because they don't feel safe. They don't feel like welcome and they don't feel like they belong. So there's like for trans and non-binary folks to have gender neutral bathroom is like a physical, really visible way to show that you care about their own identities and how they feel. And I would also work around improving the health coverage, insurance coverage to cover transition benefits. And I would start small. You could start by just being sure that you use pronouns, and you add them into email signatures and LinkedIn profiles to really start the conversation. If you hope to hire and keep trans people, but you don't share your pronouns, there's like already a red flag that something is not really understood. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think the kind of tangible examples you provided are really important because there are ways to set up a workplace, whether it's, physical in person or virtual, to really use common inclusive language, to really have that conversation and examine your processes. I also kind of want to bring up too, like when we're recording this episode, Transgender Awareness Week is November 13th through the 19th in the States here. Can you share an example of how specifically a leader or a company is really leaning into honoring this week, recognizing that the things we just talked about in terms of policy and making sure insurance is covered and all these things are important, and also kind of celebrating this awareness piece is also another important part to the strategy?
Yeah, so definitely it's a good opportunity to hire some transgender speakers to do like a panel or a workshop or a talk and to really pay them. So not expect underrepresented folks to do free labor and to really pay them for their time as a speaker. That's really making the space for trans people to be heard and not speak for them, but make room for them to speak is really the most important, not only for the Trans Awareness Week, but for all year long.
Yes, definitely not a fan of free labor. You have to invest not only, time, but resources. That means financial resources, internally and externally as well, if you're bringing in speakers. I know that you have been a speaker for a variety of different topics, but imposter syndrome is one of those topics that I wanted to ask you about too. What are some, myths or misconceptions you'd like to break around this idea of imposter syndrome?
So when I started working on imposter syndrome, and I'm publishing a book early 2022, so I made some surveys to understand more about it. I conducted a research, and I was surprised to see how often people were feeling imposter syndrome and how some people I wouldn't think. I thought like I would have like a higher rate for underrepresented folks versus cisgender white men, for example, to have like a difference, but I didn't see that being huge. So I really feel like we all have our own imposter syndrome, and at least for a time in our life. And 60% of people have an imposter syndrome, which is a lot. And I think we can all benefit from gaining more confidence and having a better self-esteem. And I think the systems we work in are like made for us to doubt ourselves too much. So I think there's ways to really be grounded in our inner power to achieve more, achieve better, and achieve something that is really close to our heart. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think from a systemic perspective, there is a lot that really causes ourselves and folks from historically marginalized communities to really doubt themselves too. And I think a large kind of proponent of overcoming that is the support that you have in the workplace, and a big support person to you could and should be your manager. So people managers are very much so culture conduits in a company. What role do you see people managers play in helping their team really overcome imposter syndrome?
That's a good question. And for manager, there's really like big opportunities here, like to set up positive environments where you can make mistakes, when you can be your true self is like really good for overcoming imposter syndrome. If you have like every Monday, you have a meeting and you celebrate what happened last week and you give shout outs to people, you build that sense of like, oh, I did good. See, people saw that I was doing good, because our brain is really good at trying to make us feel like we didn't do good and we're not doing enough. So having this environment of celebrating and to also allowing for mistakes. And allowing for mistakes, it's as a leader, as a manager, it's like to clearly say and own when we make a mistake, to really make that as part of the everyday life of the work. Because when we make mistakes, we're actually growing, we're actually exploring. It's the innovation works with mistakes. So if you want to have an open and really welcoming environment, mistakes should be part of it.
Yeah, mistakes and feeling like you can lean in and feel empowered to make decisions. Sometimes, you don't make the best decisions, but that is where innovation and growth comes from as well. And there's kind of the saying that it's okay to make mistakes, but also what you mentioned, the modeling behavior of as a leader, talking about times where you make mistakes and really living what you're saying too. I know you mentioned kind of a key piece of foundational work is really listening at an organization if they're interested in really thinking about company culture transformation. But how do you see employee feedback management as a really important tool for building that culture of listening? And how do you see it manifesting at really successful companies, both in an anonymous way, but also anonymous way for giving feedback?
Yeah, I think feedback is good if there's actually room to be honest. And I think as part of the company culture as well, if there's honesty and it's the same wavelength than the making mistakes. If there's room to make mistakes, there's room to be honest and vulnerable. So I think to have honest feedback means that there is room to be honest and to really share what we feel. So I believe that's a great tool, and it's even better when you're actually in a company culture that is already inclusive and respecting everyone in whatever their identities. Because when you say anonymous, if there's only like 2 Black people in the company and they give their feedback and that also include their identity of race, that's not anonymous so much, because they will know it's come from those 2 people because they're the only Black person in the company. So there's some limitation into how someone can feel safe when they share feedback if they're the only one in the company, if the company is not inclusive anymore enough. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. That psychological safety, that trust is a really important piece of earning that feedback from someone as well, and also actively listening, acknowledging that you received that feedback. Max, what's the next problem or situation you are currently trying to solve? What's taking up the most brain space?
For now, it's really publishing my book. So
yeah.
I that's like already like a full-time job on its own. So I work 1 or 2 hours every day trying to make progress. I'm in the editing phase. So all the manuscript is written. It's just now going back to it and make it better. And I'm also working on more activities because it's going to be a workbook. So activities to overcome imposter syndrome. So that's what takes most of my time and brain energy, is to like finish the book for the release early next year.
When did you decide that you would write a book and be an author and do all this research?
I decided that last year, early in the pandemic, and I had enough space and time to try to think about how I overcame imposter syndrome. You can already remove it completely, but I have tools. So I thought about the tools that I came up with over the years, and some tool that I did for like, I invented 3 years ago, but I still do. So, and then I wanted to test out with some friends, and they also enjoyed those tools. And then I hosted workshops to try those tools. And this is when I was like, oh, maybe that's worth a book for more people to access those tools. So the book on its own, I started to work on it last summer, 2020.
Incredible. Well, I'm excited to see it out in stores, out in our local independent bookstores in the Brooklyn area as well that we were talking about. The other question I have for you too, it's I think kind of related to imposter syndrome and kind of the theme that we're talking about in terms of company culture, there are adages that people say of just like bring your full self to work, like that is the goal. Do you think it's possible for folks to bring their full selves to work, and should that be the goal of companies to create that space?
Absolutely. I think it's possible, but it's not if the leadership team is not working intentionally on it. So yeah, I think there's ways to create company culture that are inclusive and are like really taking humans as humans and not robots. And that takes some energy, time, and dedication. And I do believe there's companies already doing a good job. I want more of those companies. Yeah.
More of those companies. It doesn't just happen. It's very intentional. It's long term. It's not companies that are thinking of this as a check the box kind of strategy as well. I have a feeling when your book is published, that'll be the answer to this next question. But right now in this moment, what is one of your kind of proudest moments in your kind of career, and kind of why?
I was very proud early this year when I worked for the Blue Ridge Labs from Robin Hood. I worked for 6 months as a fellowship, and I was working for low-income communities of color of New York. And I was proud that all my years doing, being a designer, a UX researcher, was being finally used for good, for like people who were really like needed some designer to come up with solutions for them to live better, to have a life that is more easier to go through. So we worked on projects that were for returning citizens coming out of jail or prison. I worked on a project for Black trans people and mental health. I was very proud for my skills to be used for that.
Absolutely. For folks who are not like in the kind of mindset of inclusive design, but they want to get into it and they want to make their product, service, or process more equitable, do you have any advice for them based on in your experience in doing this work on a day-to-day basis, where they even start or questions they should be asking themselves?
Yeah, so there's something called the universal design, which is like when you design for the people with the most needs, with the less privilege. So if you start designing for people who have the most needs, you will design better. You will design a better service or a better product for everyone. So I will look into that type of inclusive design to see how the framing of the work is a bit different from other tech companies, when it's more like you design for the most people that you can have access to their money. And that's not the same as you design for the person with the most needs and the less privilege. So I would go into universal design.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of call to action as well. Just for folks who are getting into it and they're just like, we want to be part of the conversation and designing for folks as well on a granular level. Is there anything that I either didn't ask you in this conversation, or maybe one key insight you want to bold, underline, italicize, put in capital letters for folks listening to our episode here today?
Well, I'm gonna do a self-promotion of the book. The book is already in pre-order. So if you go to my website, maxmasure.com, you can have access to the book page, and it's already in pre-order. That's my bold promotion.
There we go. We love it. Okay, I'm gonna put your website in the show notes and make sure that folks have access to it. Max, thank you so much for being a guest on Reimagining Company Culture, and I'm looking forward to keeping in touch with you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening at AllVoices, we really believe in that employee feedback management to cultivate psychological safety, and think it's a requirement for the company to succeed as a whole. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.